Okay everyone, you're very welcome this evening to this on Staire, the Historical Studies Society of the University of Galway's third lecture in their present series of lectures on the general theme of impactful or indeed important Irish general elections. And this evening's lecture is on the topic of the 1948 general election under the general heading of "Put them out," which was a phrase that was used at that time. Now, as I've alluded to in other fora, all general elections, of course, are important in terms of their impact and their expression of the democratic will of the people, and as a means by which the machinery of the democratic process can be oiled and maintained from time to time. But I think it is fair to say that some elections are more important, you could argue, than others. And for those of you who joined us at our first lecture in this series on the subject of the 1927 general elections, you might recall that in that lecture we considered how the two elections of 1927 served to concretise Irish democracy during the turbulent period of the 1920s. And then in our second lecture on the 1932 and the 1933 general elections, we saw how the peaceful transfer of power between Civil War enemies was effected and further, if you will, concretised Irish democracy as a consequence. And of course, as we also noted, with respect to those two elections of 32 and 33, they initiated what would become a 16-year period of consecutive Fianna Fáil power in Ireland, with Eamon de Valera as head of government. Now, whilst the subject of tonight's lecture, the 1948 election, arguably wasn't as transformative as the elections which we considered in the previous lectures, nevertheless it was important because it was to result in a new type of government formation, at least with respect to the Irish political landscape at any rate, that of coalition government. Now, in order to understand the context which led up to the 1948 general election, we do have to consider briefly some of the circumstances surrounding Eamon de Valera and Fianna Fáil's rather long, unbroken period in power of 16 years between 1932 and 1948. And during that time, de Valera and his Fianna Fáil governments had been arguably quite successful in effecting many of the objectives which they had originally set out to achieve. Certainly there was a clear expansion of Irish sovereignty and independence during that period, which was expressed by virtue of the disentanglement from aspects of the treaty settlement from 1921, which had so annoyed certain anti-treatyites at any rate. Some pro-treatyites were annoyed with it as well, but were just prepared to put up with it, as it were. You also had the implementation of a new constitution in 1937, the Bunreacht na hÉireann, which effectively made Ireland a republic in all but name. And then just prior to the outbreak of the Second World War, you had the success of Eamon de Valera's Fianna Fáil governments ending the economic war, but also getting back the 3 treaty ports which the British forces, or the British Navy, had continued to occupy or utilise in the aftermath of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. These 3 ports here in Southern Ireland had the potential, in theory at any rate, of dragging Ireland into the Second World War in the event that such a war was to take place, which of course, as we know, it did. So by gaining those ports back in 1938, it allowed Ireland to, or Southern Ireland at any rate, the Irish Free era, Southern Ireland, to adopt a policy of neutrality during the Second World War, which was quite popular here domestically at that time. And so de Valera found that he was supported in this not just by supporters and members of Fianna Fáil, but even by the other political parties in Parliament, and I think it's fair to say by the public at large. So in many ways, at least in terms of expanding sovereignty, demonstrating independence, the Fianna Fáil governments have been quite successful during their 16 years in government. However, there was still disgruntlement within the Irish population from time to time, and this was first expressed significantly for de Valera in the 1943 general election. We were one of the few states to hold general elections, at least in the Western context, during the Second World War, and in that 1943 election, which was a wartime election of course, de Valera's government was placed in a rather negative position electorally. There had been levels of economic deprivation, understandably due to rationing and an absence of resources as a consequence of the war. The Fianna Fáil governments had implemented a wage freeze, and there was a certain degree in which both parties of the far right, though fringe, appear to be gaining some traction. Ultimately, they will be electorally unimportant in the end, but they appear to be gaining some traction for a period of time. And then parties more of the left, such as the Labour Party, appear to be gaining some support as well during the early 1940s. So this was a potential threat to Fianna Fáil dominance on the electoral scene. With the result then that in that election itself, Fianna Fáil lost seats. They lost 10 seats in the 1943 general election. But they remained, by any stretch of description, the largest party in Parliament, having double the level of representation of the second largest party, the Fine Gael party, which returned with just 32 seats, a decrease of 13 on their previous outing in 1938. And as we shall see later, Fine Gael had been on a successive or a concerted downward trajectory since its formation in 1933. The Labour Party did have some success in this election, gaining 8 seats up to 17, showing that there was something of a resurgence in, I suppose, opposition to the economic restrictions and privations, if you will, of the Second World War. And then a relatively new party on the scene, Clann, which translates as the family of the land, or the family of the land, yes, was a kind of an agriculturally orientated party. They gained 10 seats, and then you had a number of independents of various hues. But ultimately, as you can see there, Fianna Fáil returning with 67 seats did not have an overall majority, with the result that De Valera had to rely on the support of some independents, in particular one independent, just to be elected Taoiseach at the end of that 1943 election. So being in a minority government position was not something De Valera was very comfortable with, and so he very quickly called another election for 1944. And as I think I mentioned or alluded to already, De Valera would have something of a penchant for calling snap elections when the situation suited him. And on this occasion, the gamble paid off, because probably partially as a consequence of the arguments of Fianna Fáil that a minority government is not a strong one and there is no alternative to us, you should return us with a stable and strong government. And perhaps there was an element of buyer's remorse for some electors for having spread their votes around to some of the smaller parties. So consequently, during this time of war and this request for a stable and strong government, the electorate responded positively on this occasion, just a year later, or less than a year indeed, to De Valera and Fianna Fáil's call, with the result that in the 1944 election, Fianna Fáil did quite well, gaining 9 seats and returning with 76 seats in total. That's a 6-seat majority. As you can see also in terms of the other parties, Fine Gael continued their downward trajectory, losing 2 more seats down to 30. Labour did not do so well in this particular election, but it wasn't just because of a rejection by the electorate. There was also some difficulty with respect to internecine warfare within the Labour movement. There was a split in the Labour Party, which I'll allude to later, but this also impacted their vote. And then you can see the returns there for Clann and independents as well, each of which were down arguably to the benefit of Fianna Fáil. So from 1944 onwards, De Valera was in a strong electoral position, and it had a strong position in terms of the Dáil arithmetic in Parliament, a firm and stable single-party government. But in the aftermath of the Second World War, you begin to see some of that disgruntlement that I had alluded to from the 1943 election coming back to the fore again. And there is an argument to be made that there was a degree of stubbornness, perhaps even hubris, overconfidence, laziness even to some respects in relation to these De Valera's governments. And of course you had stagnation to a certain extent, both in terms of the Irish economy, but also to a certain extent with respect to government itself. So for instance, in relation to stubbornness, for example, some of you may already be aware of the furore, particularly in the international press, that occurred when on the death of Adolf Hitler in 1945, De Valera chose to pay his condolences to the German or the Nazi German ambassador to Ireland who was present here during the war. Again, we were a neutral state. Neutral states are perfectly entitled to have ambassadors from belligerent states resident, and so we had an ambassador from Germany here during that time. And De Valera made the decision, following what he felt was very strict diplomatic etiquette, to pay condolences in a personal sense, if you will, to the ambassador on the death of his head of state. But for reasons that are quite understandable for the rest of us today, this did not go down too well on the international scene to have paid respects to the ambassador of the now expired Nazi regime. But De Valera stuck to his guns, as it were, and it did give Ireland some bad press, I think it's fair to say, and probably impacted, at least in part, our application to join the UN the following year. And our application to join the United Nations was rejected, ostensibly in part because of this position that De Valera had taken in 1945, but not only, there were other reasons as well. And we didn't join the UN, as an aside, until 1955. Our applications were rejected for a number of years. Now, between 1939 and 1946, the cost of living index in Ireland had increased by 2/3, which obviously is never a positive for the ordinary man and woman on the street. But at the same time, the average weekly earnings had only increased by 1/3. So this was clearly an element of some disgruntlement. The inflation which had accompanied the privations of wartime, it had been hoped by the government that inflation would decrease or indeed dissipate at the end of the war, but it too remained stubbornly high, with the result that subsidies for food, which the government was providing for people, ate significantly into our taxation revenues. Then in 1946, you also had what was known as the harvest emergency. 1946 was one of the wettest on record at that point in time seasons and years in our history, with the result that our harvest was under significant threat. And although the government did act to try and counter this issue and to overcome it, nevertheless, it did lead to further levels of disgruntlement and, I suppose, ennui amongst elements of the general population. There was also a teacher strike then in 1946 on the issue of pay, as is typical for strikes of these natures, not always, but in most cases it does have to do with pay or remuneration. And the teacher strike, the government won in their battle against the teachers. The teachers went on strike for 30 weeks, I think, but ended up having to return to work with no concessions from the government and no increase in pay. But the publicity looked bad for the government. It made the government look like they were being, how should we say, less than favourable towards a very important segment of Irish society, a segment which has some sway in local communities. The teaching position still is, I hope, and certainly should be, a respected one in a local community. So a lot of people were sympathetic towards the plight of the teachers and were somewhat annoyed with the government not giving in to them in any respect. And I think it's also fair to say that elements of the organised structure of the teacher strike would end up switching any support they may have previously had for Fianna Fáil to an up-and-coming political party called Clann Poblachta, which I shall mention in a moment. And then lastly, for this segment, you also had in 1947 a supplementary budget, I should say a very unpopular supplementary budget that was implemented by the government. I think it's fair to say that if you have to implement or introduce a supplementary budget during your time in power, it's a negative anyway. You're kind of in trouble if you have to bring in a supplementary budget. But in this particular case, this supplementary budget increased taxes on beer, tobacco and cinema tickets. And this was not very popular for various reasons with large swathes of the population, and indeed the government could probably have only made themselves more unpopular if they'd also put taxes on those other three staple goods that is very important to the electorate: petrol, sugar and whiskey. And that's probably what saved them from a total drubbing at the next election, quite frankly. But in any event, this was not well received, as you can understand. And then there was also issues in relation to some perceptions of the government and its suspicions in some cases with respect to the government's behaviour or the behaviour of certain members of government. There was accusations and in some cases perceptions of jobbery and corruption levelled at members of Fianna Fáil during this period in time. So, for instance, Sean Lemass, who would later become famous, and some would view him as one of the greatest or most impactful Taoiseach that we've ever had, he for a while came under suspicion as a consequence of a perception that he may have helped others to speculate inappropriately on the stock market. And just very, very briefly, this was in relation to a railway company that was in very poor repair financially. And both Lemass and the owner, or one of the chairman of the railway company, had made public declarations to the effect that this company is in dire straits and maybe going into significant difficulty. This resulted in the share price falling for that particular company. But then shortly afterwards, the government introduced a programme that would reinvigorate elements of the railway services, causing the share price to spike significantly. But in that intervening period, certain people friendly with the chairman of the company and known to Lemass as well, had bought shares when they had been in a depressed state, thus benefiting quite significantly. Now, a tribunal of investigation eventually exonerated Lemass and the entire government, that it was just some forms of miscommunication by other people, but nevertheless, it didn't look good, if you take my meaning. Then there was also the issue of Dr. Con Ward, who was the parliamentary secretary, now what we call junior ministers, generally speaking. He was the parliamentary secretary in local government and, to an extent, in what was an emerging Department of Health. He was accused of effective corruption with respect to a factory which he owned in County Monaghan and the alleged misuse of government or state funds for his own personal purposes. Again, he was exonerated by a tribunal, and it's likely he did nothing wrong in that regard, but once people throw mud at you and these kind of things, it tends to stick, at least in the public mind, and so he ended up resigning his position as a parliamentary secretary, and he fell out with Fianna Fáil afterwards because he felt they had treated him badly. But ultimately, the aroma stuck towards on Fianna Fáil as a consequence of this, even though, again, it was demonstrated that nothing improper had occurred. And then lastly, you had the issue of the Lochs distillery, the attempt to sell, or the desire to sell Lochs distillery in 1947, the whisky distillery in Kilbeggan in County Westmeath. It had first appeared that an international consortium was going to buy the distillery and reinvigorate it, if you will. But it would transpire that the consortium in question was actually a bunch of international smugglers whose intention was to just take the whisky stocks that had built up during the Second World War and to sell them on the black market for a quick profit in Britain, and not to do anything to revitalise the business of Lochs Distillery at all. But because it had involved discussions with members of government, and indeed one section of this consortium had even met the Irish president, and somebody had allegedly given a gold watch, or attempted to give a gold watch from the consortium as a gift to De Valera's son, again, the whiff of corruption and potential nepotism and all sorts of words were thrown around. And again, a tribunal was instituted, and it was demonstrated in the tribunal, at any rate, that the government had done nothing wrong. Members of the government had been duped by this consortium. Nobody had intended to do anything or to engage in any malpractice. But again, this happened just before the 1948 election, and the publicity was negative as a consequence. Okay, so despite all these difficulties, there's probably a fair argument to be made that despite the stagnation and the stubbornness and, in some cases, the negative publicity that was now coming to surround Fianna Fáil at this latter end of its long period in power, De Valera and Fianna Fáil were blessed with their enemies, in that they had the political opposition which they had in Parliament was rather disparate and uncoordinated and quite at variance from each other in terms of what their political ambitions would be, meaning that Fianna Fáil appeared at least to have little to worry about with respect to the opposition, either one party gaining significant level of power or significant level of support that could overcome Fianna Fáil as the largest party, or of any other number of parties coming together to try and dislodge Fianna Fáil from government. So if we first look at the largest of the opposition parties that Fianna Fáil would have had to contend with, it was, of course, generally what was then known as the United Ireland Party, but more generally known as Fine Gael. They were seen as a fiscally conservative, socially and indeed constitutionally conservative party at this time. They were often seen as pro-Commonwealth and in some respects pro-British then from some people's perspectives. Certainly they were seen as much less nationalistic than Fianna Fáil. They were also often perceived to be aligned with the moneyed classes, or the rich people, if you will, or the larger farmers and the ranchers. These were the type of perceptions that many had to have Fine Gael at this time. But even more importantly, in terms of anything that De Valera might have had to worry about, Fine Gael had been on a downward electoral trajectory essentially since its foundation in 1933. And as I alluded to there with the 1944 election, I think it was close to 20% of the vote is all they managed to receive in that election. And this was and so Fine Gael did not seem like a major electoral threat anyway on its own to the government, despite the fact that in 1944 it did receive a new leader. The old leader, W.T. Cosgrave, stepped down in 1944, and he was replaced by Richard Mulcahy, or General Richard Mulcahy. But while Mulcahy was well liked within Fine Gael circles, he was not well liked on the Fianna Fáil side of the ledger, and in some respects on many of the other sides of the ledger either in many of the other parties. And this was because he was perhaps unfairly, as he was just one member of the original Fine Gael government and pro-Treaty Sinn Féin government from 1922-1923, but he had been the Commander-in-Chief of the Irish Army after Michael Collins, and he ended up as Minister for Defence, and therefore he was seen very much as aligned, as being linked with the execution policy that had been introduced by that first pro-Treaty Sinn Féin Fine Gael governments. And as a consequence, he was unlikely to be the kind of charismatic leader that would potentially threaten Fianna Fáil power. So the next party then of note is the Labour Party. Obviously they come from a left-wing disposition, that goes without saying. Their leader at this stage was William Norton, more generally known as Bill Norton. And Labour had supported Fianna Fáil previously on certain occasions, particularly the 1932 election, and again for a time after Fianna Fáil had to endure once again a minority government for a time between 1937 and 1938. And the Labour Party was certainly hoping, in the atmosphere of the post-war period in the 1940s, to be able to ride the same tide, or to be on the crest of the same wave which we saw in a number of other Western countries in the post-war period, in which the electorate turned towards social democratic or Labour parties, including, for instance, in our nearest neighbour Britain in the 1945 general election there. So Labour were very much hoping to capitalise on this swing left that they saw in other countries in the post-war period. However, they were stymied in this somewhat by what I alluded to already, the intra-Labour dispute that there was. There had been serious issues within the Labour movement as a consequence of the election of James Larkin, or Big Jim Larkin as he's sometimes known, in 1943. Jim Larkin now of the Irish, the Dublin lockout fame, etc. Larkin was, I think it's fair to say, he was a very excellent, he was an energetic organiser and a man who could evoke strong emotions in people. And well, he annoyed quite a lot of people as well, with the result that when he was allowed to be an official Labour candidate in that election and got elected, the largest union, the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, which had fallen out with Larkin many years before that, they disaffiliated themselves from the Irish Labour Party and even accused the Irish Labour Party of allowing itself to be infiltrated by communists. And I know terms like socialism and communism are quite popular on campuses today, but back then it was very much seen as a negative to be associated with communism or socialism. Even just socialism, you were quite negative to have it applied to you at this point in time in Ireland. So the ITGW would accuse the Labour Party of being infiltrated by communists, and indeed James Larkin had been, in effect, an Irish communist, or he claimed he was at any rate, in the 1920s himself. So with the consequence not just of the ITGW disaffiliating from Labour, but other members of the Labour Party who were sympathetic to the ITGW perspective on Larkin also left the Labour Party. So 6 TDs left the party in 1943, and in 1944 those 6 TDs formed the basis of a new Labour Party, the National Labour Party. So the National Labour Party was established in 1944, and its first leader was this man here, James Everett. And it adopted much the same modus operandi and raison d'etre as its mother party in the Labour Party, but did so from an anti-Labour Party perspective. So this kind of internecine strife between these two Labour parties was likely to suppress their potential support base then amongst the country at large. And it was also recognised at the time and accepted that the ITGW, and by extension the National Labour Party, which was in effect the political wing in some respects of this union, they were somewhat sympathetic to Fianna Fáil. So therefore De Valera and Fianna Fáil could possibly hope that in the event of another election in which they were in a minority position, they might be able to rely on the National Labour Party for some extra votes in Parliament. And then our next party is the Clann Party, which, as I mentioned already, translates as the family of the land. This party was established in 1939. But unlike the old Farmers' Party from the 1920s that you might recall us mentioning previously, the Clann was arguably a much better organised party with a much more energetic and enthusiastic and coordinated grassroots movement, and it was orientated much more to the west of Ireland. So it tended to be west of Ireland farmers and farming interests that gravitated towards Clann Clann would have claimed at the time that it sought to transcend the normal politics, which was at that time treaty politics. And indeed, at one point, they would even make statements to the effect that politics are not for us. They are no use to us as a grassroots organised farming movement. And this might seem incongruent with the fact they were running for election, but the point is that when they said politics, they meant old school Irish pro and anti-treaty politics, in effect is what they meant. Now, this party took a rather nuanced position on the issue of derating of agricultural land. And this is part of the reason why, again, as I say, they were initially more focused towards the west than to the east. So there were other farming organisations that could have joined in with Clann in its early days, such as the National Agricultural Party in the east of Ireland that was more orientated in Leinster. But that party, the NAP, they wanted to derate all agricultural land, so there'd be no rates having to be paid on any agricultural land. But Clann were, I suppose, they took a somewhat classist approach to it, if you will. They were of the view that, no, you should still have rates on very rich land or people who have a lot of good, rich land. In other words, again, the big farmers or the ranchers. Whereas people on smaller holdings or with poorer land, they should have no rates. So they took a more nuanced approach to an extent than the NAP. But by 1943, the two organisations had come together and you had a united kind of farming interest party in Clann vis-a-vis the entire state. But nevertheless, the major centrifugal area for the grassroots movement for Clann was Connacht and the west of Ireland. Now, there were questions which emerged in subsequent years, not so much at the time, about the attitude of its first leader, not this man you see here, but another man, a man called Michael Donlan, who was the first leader of the party. It's fair to say that Donlan made some injudicious comments in relation to himself and Adolf Hitler. He compared himself to Hitler once or twice by essentially saying he wants to do what Hitler's doing, get rid of all the establishment guys and all the old politicians that have kept the country down, etc. But then there were other occasions in which Donlan also made comments that were demonstrably anti-Semitic in their nature. And for instance, at one event, I think it was actually an Ardèche of Clann, he was to say that the very raison d'etre of Clann is to break the stranglehold of the money grubbers and the Jews in Ireland. This was a direct quote from Donlan himself. So there was definitely some anti-Semitism present there. Now, with that said, there was a lot of incipient anti-Semitism in Ireland at that time anyway. I think it was much more prevalent than some of us would like to believe now. So he probably wasn't alone in some of these ideas that he had. But nevertheless, it didn't do a whole lot of damage to him at the time, but it kind of tarnished his reputation later. Whereas the second man to be leader, Joseph Blowick, he was to be much more judicious in his comments. But nevertheless, the Clann party also, in addition to being orientated towards farming interests, it also played the green card, and I mean the political green card from time to time. Now, virtually every party played the green card, the political green card from time to time. But Clann was regarded even by Dr. David McCullough, the historian and RT presenter, as appearing even more Republican than Fianna Fáil from time to time. And one example of this was in May 1946, their first leader, Michael Donlan, made a request in Parliament that there should be a Dáil committee set up to investigate the death of an anti-treaty IRA hunger striker in a Portlaoise prison at that time. So, and as we shall see later, they would make irredentist rhetorical statements from time to time as well. So they were mixing their agricultural interests with irredentist nationalist interests as well. And then the last kids on the block here, I think, for our discussion then was another new party that came into being in 1946, Clann na Poblachta, which translates as the children of the land, or if you wish, the family of the land. So, sorry, I apologise. Clann na Poblachta, which translates as the family of the Republic, or the children of the Republic. There's two clans, so sometimes you can get them mixed up. So Clann na Poblachta emerged essentially out of a group known as the Republican Prisoners Release Association. And this was an organisation largely or significantly organised by anti-treaty IRA people or those sympathetic to the anti-treaty IRA who were seeking to get anti-treaty IRA men who had been interned or imprisoned during the Second World War here in Ireland, out of prison. But out of that association, then eventually a new political party was established under the leadership of Sean MacBride, who you see there. MacBride himself was a former member of the anti-treaty IRA, fought in the Civil War on the side of the anti-treaty IRA. He briefly was Chief of Staff of the anti-treaty IRA during the 1930s, but in the aftermath of the 1937 Constitution, he moved away from violence and towards strictly constitutional and democratic politics. So he kind of followed the same line as did De Valera, just a little bit later. And MacBride, you could say, was regarded by some as being, if you don't regard the concept as incongruous, Republican royalty, in the sense that his father had been Major John MacBride, who'd been executed during fighting for the Republican side, if you will, during the 1916 Rising. And his mother was Maud Gonne MacBride, who some of you may know was a feminist and for a time a ardent nationalist activist, and also, of course, for a time, or for most of her life, I believe, a muse for William Butler Yeats. So he was seen as kind of Republican royalty in that sense. And because he spoke English with a somewhat pronounced French accent, because he had spent time in France living there, he was seen as somewhat exotic as well. So this was an exotic man leading a new party, a party which saw itself as more Republican than Fianna Fáil, more irredentist than Fianna Fáil, more prepared to, in their view, be energetic in their fight to unite Ireland and make Ireland an official republic than Fianna Fáil were. Because at this point in time, in the early mid-1940s, Ireland was still not officially a republic. As I mentioned, our constitution made us a republic in all but name, but De Valera had not taken that final step to declare us to be legally or officially a republic. So Clann Poblachta was basically arguing that they were going to do that. Obviously, they were, not obviously, but as you can imagine, they were quite irredentist in their rhetoric with respect to Northern Ireland, seeking that they wanted to reunify the national territory as it was. But they also argued from a socially radical perspective from time to time, and with respect to uniting Ireland, MacBride and others in Clann Poblachta did argue that in order for unity to happen in a manner that would be most comfortable for unionists in Northern Ireland, we do need to increase our economy, improve our economy here, and to make social and economic conditions in the south at least equal to what they currently are in Northern Ireland. Now, as I mentioned, Clann Poblachta did attract some disgruntled Fianna Fáilers who felt that Fianna Fáil were no longer Fianna Fáil enough, but it also, for instance, would have attracted other social radicals and most likely did gain some sympathy from those who supported the teachers during the teachers' strike as well. But as Dr. David McCullough has also pointed out, from the very early stages, there were tensions within Clann Poblachta between the old school nationalists, those who were just, focused on the national question, and the more younger, if you will, and hungrier socially radical elements that also were attracted to the party at that time. And an example that would occur later of this tension between old school and new school was the tension that would emerge in part between the leader, Sean MacBride, and a man called Noel Brown, who would later be Minister for Health, a Clann Poblachta man himself, and in government with MacBride later. So as I say, it's arguable that De Valera was blessed with his enemies, because how was any of these parties that I've just mentioned ever going to get on with each other in any prospective government? The two Labour parties hated each other and were calling each other communists. The Fine Gael party was seemingly anyway pro-Commonwealth, and from the perspective of people like Clann Poblachta, pro-British. The Fine Gael, and so Clann Poblachta would never want to work with Fine Gael, you'd imagine. The Fine Gael supporters, you'd imagine, would never want to work with an almost unreconstructed anti-treaty IRA man like Sean MacBride. And then you had the Clann party, who arguably in some ways said they didn't even like politics at all, or at least didn't like all the other politicians because they're not doing what's needed to improve the lot of agricultural interests. However, there was signs as a consequence of the 1945 presidential election, which occurred in advance of the 1948 election, that perhaps some coalescing of the opposition could occur. So in this particular presidential election, you had three candidates running: Sean Taoiseach for Fianna Fáil, Sean McEowen on behalf of Fine Gael, and then a third candidate, technically an independent candidate, this man Patrick McCartan, but he had the support of the Labour Party and Clann and some independents who rode in behind him. Now, the important point here is ultimately Sean Taoiseach, the Fianna Fáil candidate, won the election and became Ireland's second president. But when we looked at how the transfers occurred between the other two parties, this is where things got interesting, or appeared potentially interesting. McCartan, he came third behind Sean McEowen, who came second for the Fine Gael party. But McCartan's 19% of the vote, when that was examined in terms of where his transfers went once he was eliminated, 55% of his transfers after he was eliminated went to Sean McEown of Fine Gael. And only 12% of his transfers went to Sean T. O'Callagh, and the rest were non-transferable. But the fact that so many of his transfers went to the Fine Gael candidate indicated that there was some elements of a potentiality, at least, for elements of the opposition to perhaps coalesce in a future situation. So as I say, as we come to the end of the De Valera's government from 1944 to 1948, there was these images of potential corruption and jobbery being associated in some circles with him. He had to deal with the issues or the concerns of the electorate and disgruntlement with respect to the economy. And then there was this new electoral threat which came from the Clann Poblachta party, as I mentioned. And this became particularly acute in October 1947, when Clann Poblachta, having only been established the year before in 1946, won 2 by-elections on the same day in October 1947, with Sean McBride himself, the leader, winning a seat. And these by-elections, these seats, from a Fianna Fáil perspective, should have been Fianna Fáil seats, but they were won by Clann Poblachta. And this made De Valera worry. He was concerned that if Clann Poblachta was now allowed sufficient time to organise itself, it would generate an electoral machine that could do significant damage to Fianna Fáil, with a consequence that he opted to call another, not a snap election, but a pretty early election in 1948 in order to try and stymie the growth of Clann Poblachta. He dissolved the Dáil on the 12th of January 1948 and went to the country for an election. But that was almost a year and a half ahead of when he needed to. And he still had a majority in the Dáil at this point. He still had a majority. So it was obvious, I think it's fair to say, that he called the election in order to stymie the growth of the Clann Poblachta party. So the campaign then. Well, even before the campaign in 1948 began, just prior to that, Fianna Fáil had pulled something of an electoral stroke, or an attempted electoral stroke, with the Electoral Amendment Act of 1947. In this act, the number of seats in the Dáil were increased from 138 to 147 seats. So this, from a Fianna Fáil perspective, was an opportunity maybe for them to gain extra seats, or to keep some of their own number of seats, even if there were other parties, new parties gaining new seats. However, in that act, under the Electoral Amendment Act, the government also dissolved 3 constituencies which were still 7-seat constituencies, and they abolished those constituencies and replaced them with 3- and 4-seat constituencies. Now, for those of you familiar with our system of our PRSTV voting system, I won't go into the minutiae of it, but just you can take my word for it if you're not familiar with it, that the higher number of seats in a constituency, the greater the chance of a smaller party getting a seat in that constituency. The higher number of opportunities in terms of seats, the more chance a small and unpopular or not as popular party might gain a seat. But by dissolving those constituencies and replacing them with 3- and 4-seat constituencies, and indeed increasing the number of 3-seat constituencies overall from 15 to 22, what Fianna Fáil were doing was making it more difficult in each constituency for a smaller party or a less popular party to gain a seat. So if you have a 3-seat constituency, the chances are, on average, the 3 most popular parties in any given circumstance in the country is likely to gain 1 or 2, or at least 1 each of those particular seats. Now, it doesn't translate exactly that because it depends on local issues too, but by and large. So it was more likely, it seemed, that Fianna Fáil would benefit from more 3-seat constituencies than these 7-seat ones. So this was seen as something of a political stroke. The government would argue that its purposes was to ensure stable government by not having a proliferation of small parties in Parliament, and there's some argument to be made for that, I think. But nevertheless, it was seen as a political stroke. There was also a pre-election decision by the government to introduce weekly payments to people suffering from tuberculosis at this time, which, again, this was a positive thing, of course, but the fact that it happened just before the election was then used by some of De Valera and Fianna Fáil's opponents as an argument that they were trying to buy votes, if you will, and why didn't they do this earlier? Now, in terms of their own campaign then themselves, Fianna Fáil were very much arguing that in the post-war context, everything is coming right for us, just give us a bit more time and we'll sort everything out. And there was a general argument by the Fianna Fáil campaign, and you can see from the poster here, that you shouldn't change captain midstream, as it were, of the boat. If you want to keep the boat steady, you keep the right captain, the man who led us through the economic war and the world war, keeping us neutral, and now in the post-war crisis that may be coming in terms of economic issues, then again, you should rely on the man you know, Eamon de Valera. And indeed, they stuck with that phrase. Another phrase that was used by Fianna Fáil at the time was, the dev you know is better than the devil you don't know. This was an argument, of course, that you don't know what you'll get if you vote for the other parties, so vote for Eamon de Valera and Fianna Fáil. Now, it's possible, I think, that that phrase may have had some relation to a kind of an indirect dig, as it were, at Winston Churchill, who, as some of you may know, Winston Churchill and Eamon de Valera did not get on very well as a consequence of Ireland's neutrality during the Second World War, and de Valera was known to Churchill was known to refer to de Valera from time to time as Devil Era. So it's possible that maybe Fianna Fáil were making some lemonade there with some lemons on that one and having a little joke at Churchill's expense. I'd like to think so anyway, because I think that would be funny. Now, the government also promised to increase food subsidies if they were returned to power. They also promised to adapt the compulsory tillage policy, which was quite unpopular in the country. So Fianna Fáil said that they would decrease the level of quota and allow free choice of what crop people had to grow. And then, of course, they spent a significant part of their campaign warning against weak government that you would get with a potential coalition, and that coalitions were a threat of themselves. And indeed, de Valera was to state, this country is going to be doomed. This country, if there was a coalition, this country is going to be doomed because I regard it as doom myself if there should be a government by coalition. And then, as I alluded to earlier with respect to the National Labour Party and some of their members being sympathetic to Fianna Fáil as an indicator of the reciprocation in that regard, a lot of Fianna Fáil candidates advised their supporters to transfer their votes further down to National Labour candidates. So the Fine Gael campaign, well, Fine Gael to some extent tried to argue on their previous record 16 years earlier of being in government as Cumann Gael, their previous incarnation. So there was a lot of references to their good record, as they saw it, of the 1920s, with an argument then that Fine Gael can do it again. And so there was an element of return us to power so we can repeat the good work we had done in the 1920s. But there was a kind of a change mantra, and that's a very popular mantra of late in Irish elections. Change, it's a lovely word, it's bandied about quite regularly. And there was a kind of a change mantra in that regard, with an argument by Fine Gael, vote for us, we can give a fair deal for young Ireland, for young people. And they did even have posters, as you can see there, even one saying, to every voter under 30, let us tell you about what a good job we did in the past and what we can do for you in the future. The party placed a heavy emphasis on the need to elect a new government. So again, the change trope was utilised there again. And then in specific areas, they followed what you could call the typical Fine Gael line of reduce the cost of living, introduce tax decreases so that you can decrease expenditure, and which will ultimately bring down the balance of payments, etc. So there was a general argument there about decreasing taxes on ordinary people, and also in the hope of invigorating private enterprise to a certain extent there as well. And like all the parties, as we shall see, they promised to end jobbery and corruption as they saw it within government, and they adopted a very anti-Fianna Fáil perspective. But as I said, their new leader, Richard Mulcahy, perhaps not the most charismatic man on the campaign trail, though a very good organiser for the party, but he had that old albatross, if you will, around his neck from some people's perspectives with his association with the Civil War. So the Labour campaign then, also a change election is what they were very much arguing for. They castigated Fianna Fáil constantly, regularly on the campaign trail, particularly on that issue of what they saw as the late payments to the TB sufferers. Labour had been arguing for payments for TB sufferers for years and felt that Fianna Fáil were very late to the table. They also argued for the creation of a national housing council to deal with the significant depression in house building that had occurred, or decrease in house building that had occurred during the Second World War. They advocated for the nationalisation of the railway system and of CIE, or Chorus Umper Éireann. They also wanted changes in education and were seeking an inquiry into the entire organisation of the education system in Ireland. They also advocated for price controls. And in connection then with that issue relating to tuberculosis, they also had a particularly striking argument in relation to what they called the wings of death. And this was with respect to, firstly, what they saw as the government's lack of concern until recently for people suffering with tuberculosis, in which Labour were saying the kind of payments that are being issued now would only amount to approximately $250,000 a year, whereas just recently the government had spent over approximately $350,000 on a number of transatlantic aeroplanes, actually $350,000 for each one, on a number of transatlantic aeroplanes, which Labour were now castigating as luxury airliners for people of means who would be travelling back and forth from America to Ireland. And instead of using money on luxury items like that, they should have been spending the money on people who needed it, as they would say, people, for instance, with tuberculosis. And so there was this trope of the wings of death being associated with Fianna Fáil by Labour, and another mantra that they used then was give us life before luxury. So that was the general Labour campaign. And as I say, Labour were hoping to capitalise on the post-war tide which had seen Labour parties elected in other states. Now, however, the inter-Labour dispute continued into the election campaign with both official Labour Party, the official Labour Party of William Norton here, arguing that the National Labour Party, which had split away from them, were not a true Labour Party, if you will, and they were only looking to engage in personal gain politically, and that you shouldn't vote for them, obviously you should vote for us, the official Labour Party. Meanwhile, the National Labour Party were making some of the same arguments about the official Labour Party, together with accusing them outright of being communists or being infiltrated by communists. And indeed one, I think it was the leader actually, James Everett, of the National Labour Party, he would make references to his belief that certain members of the official Labour Party had spent time in Moscow and had been fighting for Marshal Tito in Yugoslavia, and they were the real rulers of the Irish Labour Party behind the scene. Now, this inter-Labour dispute then didn't help National Labour either, you could argue, in some respects, but for their actual campaign, they, first of all, they denied officially that they were involved in any kind of a pact with the Fianna Fáil party, which is something Labour was accusing National Labour of being involved in a direct pact with Fianna Fáil. But they denied this. And indeed, there were some National Labour Party candidates who were prepared to criticise Fianna Fáil quite strongly, saying that Fianna Fáil had no plan to end immigration or unemployment. And one of them compared Fianna Fáil to worn-out machinery in government. National Labour advocated that they would seek to have and implement a social insurance scheme if they had power in government or had some influence in government. And of course, they advocated for full employment and to deal with unemployment. They also sought to curb rural depopulation, something which would have chimed reasonably well with Clann, I think it's fair to say. They also wanted to see an end to ground rents, and they wanted to convert the central bank into a state reserve bank, so that that state reserve bank would be able to have greater direct control of private and public credit. And then they played the green card a little bit as well, as nearly all parties did, claiming that they seek and wish to attain political independence for the whole of Ireland. Again, this is a reference to Northern Ireland. So the Clann campaign then, the family of the land, well, they sought, as you might understand, they were seeking to promote various issues relating to agricultural interests. They advocated for supports for increased drainage of land and to make more land more arable. They also indicated their desire to expand food production here. They also advocated reforestation measures to revitalise or reintroduce forestry as a significant industry here in Ireland. They also sought greater levels of land redistribution, in other words, breaking up some of those big ranches, which were often a source of dispute and disgruntlement for Western farming interests, and to redistribute some of that land to smaller farmers. Their campaign was very much, again, an anti-Fianna Fáil campaign, with significant references, again, to the impacts of Fianna Fáil governments as they saw it on immigration in the west of Ireland. And again, like all the other parties, they played the green card. A lot of irredentist rhetoric emanated from Clann candidates. But in fairness, there was very much a focus on their part on peaceful means only of reuniting, if you will, Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. And indeed, they blamed Fianna Fáil for prolonging partition, stating at one point, I think it was the leader himself, James Blowick, I think that Joseph Blowick, that stated it: if and when the conditions forced on the country by Fianna Fáil are removed, people on both sides of the border would unite. So they were very much holding Fianna Fáil responsible. And then lastly, the Clann na Poblachta campaign. So Clann na Poblachta, as I said, adopted a very Republican, as they saw it, or quite rhetorically nationalist approach in their everyday approach to politics at any rate. But they did have to deal with allegations somewhat similar to the Labour Party. They had to deal with allegations of communism as well, particularly from Fianna Fáil candidates. And you could understand why Fianna Fáil in some respects would have adopted this approach, not simply as a means of trying to tarnish a political opponent, but because the leader of Clann na Poblachta, who I mentioned already, Sean MacBride, former member of the anti-treaty IRA, well, he had for a time in the early 1930s flirted with a socialist outgrowth from the anti-treaty IRA known as Staire era, which was an avowedly socialist organisation at that time. Now, in my opinion, MacBride became very socially conservative later on, but he was associated with this socialist element in the early 1930s, and that was used against him by Fianna Fáil. So they spent a lot of time rejecting the allegations that they were communists, and you can see there from a partial image of one of their posters, there are no communists in Clann na Poblachta. So everyone was very eager to let everyone else know there's no communists hiding under our beds in our political parties. Now, Clann na Poblachta also advocated for an expansion of the social welfare services, and again, to counter the claims of socialism, or maybe anyone attempting to claim they were socialistic, they officially adopted the social welfare ideas of the Bishop of Clonfert. So this, if we're adopting the social welfare notions of a bishop, we're hardly communists, are we? Would have been, I suppose, part of the argument. They also argued for the elimination of jobbery and corruption, so that's an easy one for all parties to throw around. They advocated for free education, all the way up to university level, in fact, and something that would chime with Labour, and arguably also to a certain extent with Clann na Talún and National Labour. They also sought to clear the slums, as it were. Now, when I say clear the slums, I don't mean clear the people, I mean they wanted to clear up the slums, clean them up, and build more housing for those in need. And they also advocated for an expansion of tuberculosis sanatoria, or places of refuge for people with tuberculosis, which was a very prevalent communicable disease here at that time. Now, they also were very much in favour of reforestation as well, which chimed quite easily, you can imagine, with Clann na Talún later on. And once again, of course, as I say, there was the irredentus rhetoric with respect to Northern Ireland, and Clann na Poblachta were very much claiming and advocating that they would seek to establish Ireland officially as a republic if they were returned to government. And they very much expected and hoped to be returned to government, because Clann na Poblachta ran 93 candidates in this election, more than any other party with the exception of Fianna Fáil. So Clann na Poblachta were really hoping to supplant Fianna Fáil as the primary nationalist party in this election, and ran a very anti-Fianna Fáil campaign as well then as a consequence. And so the term which became associated with this election, the term of put them out, referring of course to Fianna Fáil, was a term that was coined, I suppose, or that first emanated from the Clann na Poblachta literature, but came to be associated with many of the other parties as well. And indeed, on an interesting note, Clann na Poblachta was the first political party to ever create a political broadcast film, if you will, which was then shown in Ireland, that is, which was then shown in cinemas throughout the country. Okay, and then the campaign itself then did, as I say, have a Red Scare element associated with it. I've already explained National Labour were accusing the official Labour Party of communism. Clann na Poblachta were being accused of communism from Fianna Fáil, but Clann na Poblachta kind of got their own back as a consequence of this man that I mentioned already, Patrick McCartan, that former independent presidential candidate. He now came to be associated with Clann na Poblachta, and he was able to, from a publicity perspective, quite a successful retort to Fianna Fáil when he pointed out that in 1920, while De Valera was in the United States, he gave the okay for the revolutionary Dáil government to give a loan of $20,000 to the USSR in 1920, in exchange for which, as collateral, the government of the Soviet Union at that time handed De Valera, or his associates at the time in America, a section of the Russian crown jewels, which was kept here in Ireland all the way up to the 1940s, indeed later indeed, by Irish governments subsequently. So De Valera was forced to admit on the campaign trail that yes, he had okayed this loan to the Soviet Union. So he was then accused by members of Clann na Poblachta of having given seed money to communism abroad, if you will. So that softened the cough a little bit of the Fianna Fáil communist argument, I think it's fair to say. Now, the media coverage of the campaign, somewhat similar to the previous elections that we've discussed. The Irish Times generally adopted a broadly balanced approach and was was complimentary in some respects of Eamon de Valera, indicating at one point that he had a very capable intellectual ability and had showed shrewd political judgment in terms of his engagement with expanding sovereignty in the earlier years and recalling the election when he did. But they also regarded his overall campaign as being somewhat disheartening for his supporters, that he had lost some of his vigour and verve, as it were. And the Irish Times also stated that it was not in agreement with de Valera's argument that coalitions could not work. The Fine Gael party received relatively positive sympathetic coverage from the Irish Independent, as had tended to be the case for Cumann Gael in the past, but so did the concept of coalition itself. And then lastly, the Irish press, as David McCullough has stated, gave unstinting support to Fianna Fáil, which of course was understandable given that the Irish press was effectively a Fianna Fáil newspaper. And indeed, one commentator under the pseudonym of the Political Student, I think, he wrote a very positive review of the Fianna Fáil campaign, again understandably given the paper it was in, but under the heading, "The doubtfuls are swinging back." So he was making the argument that people are swinging back to Fianna Fáil. So how did it all go? Well, as you can see here from the outcome, and this is keeping in mind now that there's now an increase of seats in Parliament from 138 to 147 in terms of the seat increase. Fianna Fáil had, therefore, a bad election in that sense. They returned with 68 seats, but keep in mind, this is a decrease of 8 seats from its previous outing. There's actually more seats to gain in the Dáil in this election, so in a way it was worse than it looks than just this 8-seat decrease for Fianna Fáil. The Fine Gael party had a decrease in its vote, but still managed to return with 31 seats, but it had a lower first preference vote than before, and this was the lowest first preference vote it ever had at 19%. The Labour Party, the official Labour Party, did reasonably well, gaining 6 seats, and the National Labour Party held its own, and a little, if you will, moving up from 4 seats to 5 in this particular election. So both Labour parties increased their vote a little, increased their seat share a little bit. The new Clann Poblachta party was very disappointed. It only received 13.2% of the vote, much less than they had hoped to gain, and remember, hoped to achieve. And remember, they ran 93 candidates and were thinking they were going to sweep the boards out from Fianna Fáil. That did not happen. So in that sense, de Valera's gamble, despite losing some seats, of course, he did stymie the growth significantly of the Clann Poblachta party. And indeed, if you look at Clann Poblachta's result of 13.2% of the first preference vote, in real terms that should have translated into a higher seat number than 10 as well. But because of their overconfidence and running so many candidates in so many constituencies, they split their own vote, first preference-wise, in some constituencies, and so lost seats that they should have gained based on their overall vote share. Clann were down 2 seats, as you can see, to 7, and then you had, again, a variety of various independents. So in the aftermath of the election, that left us with the question, what is going to happen? And so from the point of view of those who want to get Fianna Fáil out of power, if you look, as I say, at the numbers, their only option was to band together. Fianna Fáil had 68 seats, which was 6 shy of an overall majority. But if all the other parties, Fine Gael, the Labour Party, the Clann Poblachta Party, the Clann Party, the National Labour Party, and at least some independents, if they all came together, they would have enough seats to gain an overall majority and keep Fianna Fáil out of power. But how likely was that to happen, given that, as I've outlined earlier, the significant policy and in some cases historical differences between those various parties and their leaders? But I suppose needs must, as the case may be from time to time, and the anti-de Valera antipathy was so strong within quite a number of these parties and amongst these leaders that very quickly, once the leader of Fine Gael, Richard Mulcahy, began the process of engaging with the other party leaders, he found them to be quite receptive. The leaders of the other parties here that you see here, the Labour Party, Clann and Clann Poblachta, were quite receptive to the idea of coalition and putting Fianna Fáil out of power. And this man here, James Dillon, who was kind of the unofficial leader of a number of independents, of 6 independents that kind of coalesced under him, under his coordinating umbrella, he was very receptive to joining a conglomerate, if you will, or a coordination of parties in order to get de Valera out of power. There was one major hitch, however. Clann Poblachta and the Labour Party in particular were not prepared to accept Richard Mulcahy as the potential Taoiseach of this new government. As the leader of the largest party of this prospective government, with all these parties involved, it would be understandable that Fine Gael and Mulcahy, as leader of Fine Gael, would expect he'd be in the prime position to be the leader of the government, the Taoiseach. But both Clann Poblachta and the Labour Party, they knew that some of their supporters certainly would not like to have Richard Mulcahy as the leader of the government, and they might not support their parties going into power. And so they made the argument that they did not want any one leader of a party to be Taoiseach. They didn't say it was just because of Richard Mulcahy, but it probably was. But their argument was no one leader of a party should be the Taoiseach, it should be somebody else. So very quickly Mulcahy, in what David McCullough again has stated was arguably one of the most noble gestures in Irish politics, he stepped aside and said, no problem, let's find someone else within Fine Gael that will be acceptable to all the other party leaders. So after some discussion and a bit of back and forth, the person that was agreed upon was John A. Costello, who was generally referred to then as the reluctant Taoiseach, because when he was approached by Richard Mulcahy and others in Fine Gael and asked, will you take the position in order for this government to be formed, he initially refused. He said, I don't want to be Taoiseach. You be Taoiseach, General Mulcahy, or somebody else. I don't want the job. But ultimately he was prevailed upon because it was argued that he was one of the few men, even within Fine Gael, that all the other party leaders could accept. He was very personable, very well liked even by the other political party people, and he was the acceptable compromise choice. But there was still one hitch that there might be. There was one party missing, the National Labour Party, and you still needed another party in order to have enough numbers to get over the line for an overall majority. But as I mentioned, the National Labour Party had previously been somewhat sympathetic to Fianna Fáil, and even on the eve of, almost the eve of the vote in Parliament on the 18th of February to decide who would be Taoiseach, would it be Eamon de Valera or somebody else? Even close to the eve of that, the ITGWU, the union that was most influential over the National Labour Party, directed the National Labour Party, as they saw it, directed their TDs to vote for de Valera on the 18th of February. But as it transpired, the actual members of the parliamentary party of the National Labour Party, the politicians, they saw it differently. And James Everett, the leader of the National Labour Party, did come on board and joined with the other party leaders to vote with the Labour Party, Fine Gael, Clann Clann Poblachta and 6 independents to make John A. Costello Taoiseach on the 18th of February. And so we have an end after 16 years to Fianna Fáil, 16 consecutive years of Fianna Fáil power, and we have a new form of government, what became known as the inter-party government, with all these various parties coming together and divvying up the various roles and ministerial portfolios between them. Though Lamass, he was to rather disparagingly refer to this new government as a makeshift majority, that they cobbled it together and that it wouldn't be very stable. And there is an argument to be made that the cabinet did have a lot of prima donnas in it, there's no doubt about that, because most of them were party leaders. But nevertheless, it was to work reasonably well for 3 years before we had the next general election in 1951. So briefly, the consequences of the 1948 general election. Well, it was to ultimately demonstrate that coalitions could work, because as I say, this makeshift majority government did last for 3 years. It had tensions and issues, but it did last for 3 years. So it proved that, notwithstanding what Fianna Fáil had been claiming before the election, coalitions could be formed and they could work. It would also ultimately lead, this election and its outcome would lead ultimately to the resurgence of the Fine Gael party. As I mentioned, it had been on a downward trajectory for many years prior to that, but because it got into government as part of this coalition arrangement, it began to be seen as a more viable going concern by the electorate thereafter, and its vote share would increase significantly. Another consequence of the 1948 election was, as I said, it stymied the growth of the Clann Poblachta party, and ultimately it would never achieve its ambition of supplanting Fianna Fáil, and indeed by 1965 the Clann Poblachta party was gone. On a more positive note, the 1948 election and the consequent coalition government led to the reunification of the Labour Party. The antipathy between National Labour and the Labour Party decreased once they were all sitting around the same cabinet table and sharing the same issues and the same problems, and it resulted in the party reuniting in 1950. And also then, of course, another consequence is that it demonstrated once again to the electorate and to political commentators the shrewdness of Eamon de Valera. Yes, he had lost the election, but he had stymied the growth of what was a potentially serious threat in the Clann Poblachta party. But then on the other side of the ledger, it also proved ultimately that Fianna Fáil could in fact be beaten. So, in conclusion, the 1948 general election marked a key moment in Irish electoral history, not for the depth of change it brought to the administration of the state or to the fortunes of the Irish economy, nor, for that matter, to the everyday lives of ordinary citizens. In this regard, the level of transformation proved somewhat limited. Rather, it proved to be a key moment because it demonstrated that change, even if only at governmental level, was truly achievable at all. For those who harboured antipathy towards the Longfellow, Éamon de Valera, what had seemed a near impregnable bastion of Fianna Fáil power had finally been successfully assailed, and 16 years of de Valera's dominance was brought to an end, at least for a time. And that time, the approximately 3 years in which the first inter-party government held power, was, no doubt, a shorter tenure than the 5-year terms we are more used to in recent years. And it was a tenure that was cut short due to Dáil defections and internal tensions. Nevertheless, the inter-party government was birthed by the circumstances of the 1948 election, and it remained in power far longer than many of its critics and perhaps even some of its supporters would have expected. There was some truth, no doubt, to Sean Lemass's sardonic remark that the new administration was a makeshift majority. This collection of distinct parties with divergent histories and different priorities, and often rather disparate personalities, was, in political terms, something of a Frankensteinian beast. However, much like that benighted character in Mary Shelley's novel, the first inter-party government demonstrated that unexpected and unlikely political combinations can work successfully, if imperfectly, together. And ultimately, it proved that in Irish politics, coalitions would now be a feasible and a reasonably stable alternative to single-party government. And with that, I shall leave you with Dr. David McCullough's concise synopsis of this election. 1948 was one of the most crucial years of Irish democracy. Just as 1922 showed that the majority had the right to decide the future of the state, and 1932 proved that the losers of the Civil War could, with time, reverse that defeat through democratic politics, so too the general election of 1948 indicated to the opponents of Fianna Fáil that it was, after all, possible to beat Dev. Thank you very much for your time and for listening.